Hi guys, and welcome to part 2 of my Hammer ranking. I presume if you're here you've already checked out my part 1 video where I went from 50th to 26th, or maybe you've just come straight to this one because you just want to get to the really important part of the ranking. Fair enough. But today I'm going to be going from 25th to 1st. We're talking about the creme de la creme of Hammer today. So let's dive straight into it and find out what is my 25th favourite Hammer film of all time. So at number 25 we have Plague of the Zombies. This is not your traditional zombie film. It came out before Night of the Living Dead, so at this point in time the traditional zombie rules had yet to have been established. The zombies in this are essentially voodoo controlled. They're like controlled slaves for an evil local landowner who lives in Cornwall. And I like the fact that this film is set in the southwest. I went on lots of holidays when I was a kid to Devon and Cornwall, so I feel like I've got a little bit of a spiritual connection to the area. Yes, possibly the film wasn't actually shot down there, but I buy into the illusion, so it doesn't matter. Now, probably the highlight of this film is the conclusion. There's a really exciting ending in a mine shaft. The hardest part of a horror film is often the ending, so I think that's part of the reason why this film is charted in the top half of the ranking, if you like. Yeah, we've got a situation where there's like zombies all over the place in a mine, and the characters are getting onto this elevator shaft while there's fires breaking out and everything's going to hell. It's good stuff. And I think even the house above ground gets set on fire from memory. I can't remember much about the characters, I've got to say, but I like this film. Once you get your head around the fact that it's not going to be Hammer's version of Night of the Living Dead, I think you're in for a good time. And I'm glad that it's a standalone film. I can't imagine Hammer doing more traditional zombie films later down the line. That level of violence that you get in like Romero's zombie films, I can't imagine Hammer going in for that really. But maybe right at the end of Hammer's run in the mid-70s, possibly the violence was being stepped up at that point. But in general, I think this is fine just being a one-off. There are certain one-off Hammer films I wish they'd done more of, like Abominable Snowman, and I certainly think they could have done more werewolf movies. But when it comes to this, I think it's fine just being an interesting little one-off curiosity. At number 24 we have Twins of Evil, easily the best of the Karnstein trilogy for me, and the main reason for that is because this is a proper horror film where glamour is the secondary consideration. When it comes to the vampire lovers and lust for a vampire, I kind of feel like it was the other way round. The first thing to say, I guess, if you've not seen this film, is that there aren't actually two evil twins. There's only one evil twin, and the other twin is actually quite nice, so it's a little bit of a false title, but it's a very nicely put together story. Lots of interesting threads going on. Peter Cushing plays a really nasty religious guy who's going around with a bunch of other guys burning blonde women for very little reason. There's a strange guy in a castle who's not content with being wealthy, so he's getting into like necromancy and stuff. But all the various threads resolve themselves in quite a satisfying way. I don't remember having any negatives to say about this film when I did my review. I think I gave it 4 out of 5 possibly, and I'm just surprised that we got a movie like this, because when I saw the two twins in a picture with Twins of Evil, I thought, oh god, this is going to be like The Vampire Lovers dialed up to 10 or something like that. And as much as I would have happily watched that movie, albeit when the wife was out, I'm a lot happy that they did this instead. At number 23 we have She. Now, unless I'm mistaken, I think this was the most expensive film that Hammer ever made, and I could believe that because it just looks like a more expensive film than stuff like Twins of Evil and Plague of the Zombies. So we start out in this with Peter Cushing, he's with a couple of other guys. They're ex-soldiers, I think. They're just hanging out somewhere exotic like Morocco. It's probably not Morocco, it's somewhere like that. And they end up crossing a desert to get to some secret kingdom that nobody knows about. I can't remember why they go on this journey. I've sort of forgotten a lot of the minor plot details, but they end up in this secret kingdom ruled by Ursula Andress. She's like an evil queen, and they're stuck in this place and they've got to get out, blah, blah, blah. But it's a really enjoyable film. I especially love the first half. There's a real adventure feel to this journey across the desert, and they've filmed in some really great looking locations. I mean, there's not exactly a drop-off in the second half either. I mean, the second half in the Kingdom is a lot of fun as well. There's a crazy moment in the film that really has stuck in my mind. So there's like a trial, and the evil queen, she's got these like 20 slaves who are sort of due to be punished at this trial, but she decides that they're to be dropped down a hole into this massive lava pit and just burned to death right then and there at the trial. And it's quite shocking when it happens. It's like, holy hell, you just did that? I remember watching Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and there's a moment where the villain really shows his evilness. He gets this one guy and lowers him into some lava, and when you watch that, it's like, oh, you evil twat, that's a really nasty way to kill somebody. Well, in She, the villain drops 20 people or so into lava, and it really takes you back, actually. But this film's got a lot of interesting, memorable things about it. There is a sequel called Vengeance of She. I did buy a disc for that. It's nowhere near as good as the first one. You won't be seeing that film in this ranking. My advice, if you've never seen any of these, would be to just check out the first one. At number 22, we have Fear in the Night. This is a film which was definitely better than I was expecting. I'd say this film just about falls into the horror genre, although some people might call it a thriller. It's set in a really large high school, but all the kids have gone home for the summer. We follow the film through the eyes of a young woman who lives with Ralph Bates in a cottage quite close to the school, and she can't help herself going and exploring this school, but odd things are happening. She can hear distant child voices which might be ghostly in nature. Peter Cushing is floating around. He plays the headmaster. He's acting all strange, and I won't give away what happens, but there are some interesting turn of events that happen in this movie. There's at least one really great chase sequence. Joan Collins randomly turns up with a shotgun and utterly obliterates a rabbit in a really shocking moment. But you know what? Talking about the rabbit, a couple of minutes after I was just talking about 20 men being thrown into a lava pit, it kind of puts the whole rabbit death in this film into some kind of perspective. So maybe it's not as shocking a moment, really, as I remember. But it's nice to be able to give this film a little bit of a plug, because it's a film that I would probably file under Hammer Hidden Gem, you know, if I was to make a list like that. I can imagine that this film doesn't appear that often in people's Hammer best of lists or people's Hammer rankings, so it's nice to be able to include it today, although ultimately it has only come 22nd, and the only reason I've been able to talk about it at all is because I've been doing a top 50. I think a lot of people, when they rank the Hammer films, they might just do 10 or 20, so just bear that in mind. But certainly a film that, given the fact that I don't think it's got any kind of reputation even amongst Hammer films, I was really impressed by. Number 21, we have Frankenstein Created Woman. Now, in terms of story, I've got no problem with Frankenstein using a woman this time. It stands to reason he would try the female form at some point. From a filmmaking perspective, it's slightly cynical, because they might well have done this just to save a buck, because when the woman comes back to life in this, she just looks the same as when she was alive, so they've not messed around with any practical effects or makeup or anything like that. Although, given the fact that in the previous film, Evil of Frankenstein, that was the one with the creature who had like a beanbag in his forehead and it looked kind of shit, I suppose it doesn't really matter. There are pros and cons to going down the makeup route. It took me a while to get used to this particular Frankenstein film, because Frankenstein himself is a little bit off-centre. He's not the main focus of the film. It's only really the last sort of 20-25 minutes that him and his creature take centre stage. And a lot of the film until then takes place in a cafe. We follow a lot of spoilt rich kids misbehaving and bullying people, but they all get their comeuppance eventually, so it's all good. There's a fascinating thing in this where there's like a guillotine on a hill that's just there through several generations, and it's interesting that the people in this town presumably just live under the fear of going to that guillotine. There's one lad who we see his father going to the guillotine in the prologue, and then it's like for the rest of his life he kind of feels like it's his destiny to eventually end up on that guillotine. I swear, the non-Frankenstein aspects to this film are probably the most interesting, actually. But whether that works for you, it'll be entirely different from person to person, although I think the film does have a pretty solid reputation. It's considered one of the better Frankenstein films. Number 20, we have The Gorgon. one of my most memorable film watching experiences as a child was watching that film with the Medusa in the cave and the hero cuts her head off with a sword. I think it was Clash of the Titans, or maybe one of the Sinbad movies. I get mixed up with those films. I can't remember which film it was, but a very famous scene, but it used to creep me out. I saw it several times when it was on TV as a kid. So coming into the Gorgon, I was looking forward to seeing that same kind of creature again. Unfortunately, the effects of the Gorgon are not as good as in that other film. Like, if your eyes are peeled sharply in this, you'll see like toy snakes that aren't moving very well. But they've sort of been self-aware about that and kept the creature off camera for a lot of this, so the film remains kind of creepy. You should aim to do that anyway with a villain or a monster. Not have it front and center all the time, because the scary things are what you can't see, kind of a thing. But there are some good effects elsewhere in the movie. So there's a great concept in this where the people who are turned to stone, it doesn't just happen straight away like with that other movie I was talking about, but it takes a couple of days for people to turn, and the effects they've used for that are really good. You can really feel the pain and the anguish as people are gradually turning. Plus, Peter Cushing is in the mix, elevating the material as he always does. So this is a really solid standalone, and I would expect it to be, because we're in the top 20 now. It's only the very best from here on out. At number 19, we have Kiss of the Vampire. This is not officially part of the Dracula series, but I think it should be, because the villains in this feel like cousins of Dracula who just happen to live like 20 miles away or something. And also, the shooting locations feel very similar to films like Dracula, Prince of Darkness. I actually had to watch this one again a few weeks ago because I knew I was coming up to this ranking, and there were a handful of films I knew that I would have to rewatch in order to be able to talk about them because they just faded from memory. But I was really impressed with this one on rewatch. It's got so many really cool facets to it. Great use of music with the piano scenes, and then there's a ball that takes place with people wearing masks and stuff. I really like the bat attack towards the end. It could have looked incredibly stupid, and yet somehow they've really done a great job with all the practical effects. It's actually a really effective scene and a very satisfying conclusion to the film. And there's a good assortment of villains in this as well, male, female, some really dastardly characters, but I enjoyed seeing them all get their comeuppance. My advice would be, if you're going through the Dracula films, just slip this one in between Brides of Dracula and Dracula, Prince of Darkness. It absolutely works as a little spin-off. Exactly the same tone, really. I mean, if you look at the Blu-ray box for this, and if you look at the title, Kiss of the Vampire, you sort of get the impression that this might be like a vampire black comedy or something a little bit lighter, but it's not. It's just basically the same as all the other Dracula films. It just doesn't have a Dracula character in it. At number 18, we have Curse of the Werewolf. So this was Oliver Reed's big moment with Hammer. I mean, he did other Hammer films, but this was the one where he really showed what he could do as an actor, albeit he doesn't turn up for probably half the runtime. This is a very strangely constructed story. We spend a lot of time following the backstory of Reed's mother. I can't remember his character name. A strange tale involving a rapist beggar and an evil duke. It just feels like we go on a hell of a journey before we get to Oliver Reed. But it's fascinating to watch. This is the very definition of a film which is a grower. It just somehow gets better every time I watch it. And you'd think by the time we get to Oliver Reed that the film would struggle to tell that character's story because we've used up so much of the runtime by then. But somehow it still pulls it off. I still feel suitably emotional by the end when he dies. And there's a knockout performance from Reed. The werewolf effects are pretty damn good considering when this film was made. And in all honesty, I'm just surprised that they never made more werewolf movies after this. Maybe they just thought that there was no way they'd be able to follow up Oliver Reed. Number 17, we have Dracula, Prince of Darkness. This one starts out a bit like a more modern horror film in terms of its setup. So we've got like a group of people on a holiday, and I think they've got a horse and carriage that breaks down possibly, or it abandons them at a nearby hotel, and then somehow they end up at Dracula's castle. It's something like that. And then one of them gets picked off in the middle of the night, but it could easily be from a film from like decades down the line almost. It's not until the second half of this that events revert more to what you would typically get in a film like this. And this was the first one in the series, I'd say, where Dracula gets a silly death. Like, from this point onwards, in every Dracula film, he dies in a pretty stupid way, where you just think to yourself, yeah, he could easily come back from that if they decided to make another one. It's only the first Dracula film where Cushing pulls the curtain and the light comes in. That's the only good death, really, that Dracula gets in all of these films. And the silly deaths, as I call them, start here in Dracula Prince of Darkness, where he basically gets shot and falls into an icy puddle or something like that. That's what it is in my memory anyway. But the actual castle is fantastic. There's some really great interiors in this. I think they use the same building for this that they would use for Rasputin, a film which I really don't like. You won't see Rasputin in this rankings, but when I watched that film, I instantly thought to myself, that is literally the same castle that they used for Dracula Prince of Darkness. They haven't even changed that much of what the insides look like, and I think they even used the icy thing outside the window as well. There's a character in the second half of this, I don't know his name, but it feels very much like the person that... he fills the void that Cushing probably would have filled if Van Helsing had been in this, but it's to great credit of this film that you don't actually notice that Van Helsing is missing a lot of the time. Dracula as a franchise, it would keep a very good consistent quality as it went on, but this is the first time they had to make do without Van Helsing, and I think it definitely works. At number 16, we have the original Horror of Dracula, aka Dracula. So I guess this might be a bit of a surprise to some people. Probably you thought I would put this in the top 10 at least. I mean, this is considered one of the most legendary Hammer films ever made. It's got the famous battle between Lee and Cushing. But let's just put things into perspective. It still comes 16th, and I pretty much love all the films at this point. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 when I reviewed it. I might give it 5 out of 5 if I reviewed it today, in all honesty. I mean, it's not like the film has any weaknesses, really. If I had to name one thing as to why it's come this low, probably it's not quite as fun as some of the films that I've got higher up. I mean, this is a very serious take on Dracula. It's a very serious, respectable attempt at doing a Dracula film. It's trying to adhere to the Stoker novel, I feel, whereas a lot of the later Dracula films and non-Dracula Hammer films, they do concentrate more on just being fun. I guess there is that, but ultimately a lot of this ranking is just done on feel and instinct. It's not meant to be overanalyzed. I remember the first night I watched this, it was many, many years ago. It was the first time I'd ever seen any Christopher Lee Dracula film, because I was starting at the beginning, deliberately, obviously. And it was the same day that we'd had a new settee turn up, and I was really proud of this particular settee. It was called the Texan. That's how it was described in the catalogue. It was the biggest settee I'd ever bought, because my family was expanding. I wanted something with all the kids and everybody could fit on. So I was really in a good mood when this settee turned up. I was just relieved it fitted into the living room, to be honest. But I just happened to be watching Dracula for the first time on the very same night. I had a kebab that I'd bought, and I just loved the movie. And I had one of those moments where I thought to myself, yeah, I'm definitely going to go through all these films. As it happens, it would take me quite a while to get through all of them, but still, I knew that I'd discovered something really cool that night. And you sort of, as a film fan, you don't forget those moments, do you? At number 15, we have Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. Now, you might have noticed that there's something different about me since I was talking about Dracula just now. Yeah, I went away, got myself a haircut. It's a brand new day. These are long videos, these. I can't always record them in one day. I mean, I'm a busy man. I've got 5 kids to feed. Well, 3, same thing. But getting back to Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, this is a hugely impressive film, given that it's the 5th Peter Cushing Frankenstein by this point. They've made a big effort here to take the series down a darker path again. The thing about a character like Victor Frankenstein is that he's really witty, and part of the fun of watching these movies is just waiting to see what sort of dialogue he's going to come out with. But the danger is that after a few sequels, the horror can sort of dissipate a little bit, and you're just waiting for like the one-liners and the fun scenes. But here they've really fought against those instincts and tried to give you a really dark horror film where Frankenstein is shown to be a genuine villain again for the first time in a while. Like he rapes somebody randomly in this film, Veronica, the character played by Veronica Carlson, and then he literally knifes Veronica Carlson to death later in the film. If you're trying to make me dislike a character, there's not much else you can do apart from show that character knifing Veronica Carlson to death while she was in her prime. I mean, that is probably going to work a lot of the time. But actually, it doesn't in the case of Victor Frankenstein. I still like him, even after rape and murder in this film. My favourite scene in this probably sums up the filmmaker's predicament here, because it's a brilliant scene. So Frankenstein is in a hotel. There's a bunch of characters just randomly talking about something, and Frankenstein's meant to be keeping a low profile, but he can't help himself. He just jumps in on this conversation and just starts verbally taking these guys down. But it's absolutely glorious. But like I said before, given how far we're into this series at this point, this is a massively impressive film, and definitely better than at least some of the films before it. Number 14, When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. This is my favourite of Hammer's fantasy films, and the main reason for that is that I love the main character. Her name is Sanna, played by Victoria Vetri. There's this really cute thing in this where she's on the run from all the tribesmen nearby because she's blonde and it's been decreed that she has to die. I think that's the rub of the plot, as silly as it sounds. But she goes to sleep in a dinosaur egg, and when the dinosaur comes back, it thinks that she's its baby. So for the rest of the movie, this woman has got dinosaurs literally on her side, which helps even up the numbers a little bit, because the odds really weren't on her side before this plot development comes to pass. Great finale to this. There's like a tidal wave that comes in, and all these giant crabs are washed ashore, and there's chaos, and all the villains start dying these really horrible deaths. The movie feels like a chase movie a lot of the time, when the main character and her boyfriend are trying to just stay away from the main tribe as best they can. I don't own this on Blu-ray. From what I can remember, it's quite expensive. It's like £18 or something, and you can only get it via import. But I'm happy to pay that eventually when I get around to it, because I really enjoyed this one. When I did watch it, I think I rented it on something called Ratuken. That's how to get hold of it in the UK if you fancy seeing it. Really good though. Number 13, The Reptile. This is, for me, Hammer's scariest ever creature that they came up with. Unless you're going to start counting all those weird creatures that turn up in the Lost Continent. But in terms of mainline villains, if you like, this is the scariest. This concept of a female reptile woman like hiding behind pillars and curtains and then suddenly popping out, biting somebody on the neck, and then a disease starts spreading. Yeah, it's a great atmosphere in this film. I love the production design with the large castle. The film set in Cornwall. Any film set in Cornwall always scores an immediate point with me. It's a film I rewatched quite recently as well, just a couple of months ago. Still enjoyed it just as much as ever. Good use of music. There's like a weird instrument that gets played by the rich man's daughter in this film. I love that scene. I just like the music. On the downside, the portrayal of the villagers is a little bit cheesy. This concept that they'll all just walk out of the pub when a stranger turns up doesn't really feel in any way realistic to me. And I guess the main two characters in the film are a little bit bland, but just on the strength of the creature, the villain, I just really, really enjoy this one. At number 12, we have Taste the Blood of Dracula. So this is kind of like the Frankenstein created woman of the Dracula franchise. And I don't say that because we suddenly have a female villain. We don't. It's still Christopher Lee playing Dracula, as always. But we're quite a few sequels in at this point, and we spend a lot of the runtime here following a group of men who are all kind of very dubious in character. I mean, they're visiting strip clubs behind their wives' backs. They're not very nice people, seemingly. But this is all a setup so that we can enjoy seeing them taken out by Dracula later on in the movie. So that's why I'm comparing it to Frankenstein Created Woman, which kind of does a similar thing. But there's lots to enjoy about this one. This is the one where Dracula, every time he kills somebody, he looks at the camera and goes, "The first," and then the second and the third. Who is he talking to? But it's just one of those weird things that makes me smile. His death in this film is brilliant as well. He's high up in a church and he looks around at the church, and I think he's seeing like crosses here and there around the room, and this just makes him fall off the windowsill and die randomly. I should hate this ending, and yet somehow I just love it at the same time. The final girl in this is pretty good as well. I think her name is Alice. I think what makes me like her a lot in this film is the fact that her dad is such a twat. I think some people probably think I'm off my rocker putting this one ahead of the original Dracula, but you know what? I just call them as I see them. At number 11, we have Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. So this is another Dracula film, obviously. It's the one that came out just before Taste the Blood of Dracula. It's not always easy to remember the order of these films because they're all their own individual tales. None of them have got numbers in the titles, but I think I'm right. This is the one with Veronica Carlson in it. It's easy to forget just how many Hammer films she was in. She seems to have popped up quite a few times in this ranking already. There's another actor called Brian Andrews in this, I think. I think that's his name. And these two together, they play a couple. And they are probably my reason for really liking this film because they're such a cute couple. It's very, very easy to root for them in this. The guy in particular, he's a lot of fun. He's so witty. Good use of rooftops in the movie. It feels like there's a whole other world high up above street level. It sort of reminds me of Mary Poppins. I think in the background of some of these scenes, they should have had a random guy dancing on a chimney, kind of like a knowing Easter egg kind of thing. Although maybe this film came out before Mary Poppins, so that might not have worked. I'm not sure, actually. I like this version of Dracula's castle. It's on a hill and characters have got to make a treacherous journey to get up there, and I think that's where the finale is in this. It's where we get Dracula's death, possibly. Stretching my memory a little bit. I can't remember any criticisms about this film. I'm pretty sure I didn't give it 5 out of 5 or even close, but I can't think of a single thing that I don't like about this one. In my head, it's just a really strong, well-made sequel. But it hasn't quite made my top 10, and it's now time to get into that top 10. So let's find out what are my absolute all-time favourite Hammer films, starting with this one in 10th place. At number 10, we have The Witches. This is about a school teacher who goes to live in a village somewhere, but over the course of the movie, she notices signs of the occult, I guess, and kids are acting strange, and it all comes to a head in the final act. Joan Fontaine plays the lead. It's nice to see a more mature final girl for a change rather than the usual cleavage of the week, but Joan Fontaine still looked really good at the time she did this movie, I've got to say. And the village that they found to shoot this in, absolutely fantastic. They were really lucky to get the location that they did for this. And I just enjoy the subtle nature of this film. It's not an action-packed one, but it's a really fun character journey that this teacher goes on. The journey's probably better than the destination, which is basically a bunch of silly dances as part of like a wacky local cult. But I really like this film. It's a little bit of a personal pick. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest this wouldn't get into too many people's top 10s, but for me, it's one of the best of the standalone Hammer films. At number 9, we have Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. So this was the final Frankenstein film. Peter Cushing came back for this one, having previously given way for Ralph Bates to take over. I'm not sure if they definitively knew that this was the final one at the time that they filmed it, but I suspect they would have thought that it might be, because Hammer were on the slippery slope by 1974. They've even given the character Parkinson's in this one, which suggests to me that they were certainly thinking this might be the end game. I love the location for this one. So this film takes place in a mental asylum of sorts, and I just love the design of it. It's very simple, but it works very, very well, right down to the claustrophobic little cells that the prisoners have. The creature in this one is probably my second favourite in the entire series, second only to the Christopher Lee creature from The Curse of Frankenstein. Yes, the creature here is something of like a reject from Planet of the Apes, I guess, but I just find it delightfully ironic that the creature here is probably the least human of all of Victor's creations. It's like his research has gone slowly backwards the closer he's got to the end of his life somehow. It's like the film is sort of subconsciously telling you that this was a doomed venture from the start, and things are only going to get worse the longer that this guy stays alive. But I think this is a great way for the curtain to come down on this series. I really do. I mean, for me, this is one of the best in the series. At number 8, we have The Mummy's Shroud. Out of all the Frankenstein monsters, if you want to call them that, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, the werewolf, Wolfman, whatever, out of all those creatures, I think the Mummy is probably my favourite. Seriously, ever since I was a kid, I've always felt extremely freaked out a little by the idea of this slow-moving monster covered in bandages. You can't even see his face, and he's just slowly walking towards you. I've always felt like whenever I watch a Mummy film, old or new, I'm always more keen than usual for it to succeed somehow. I just love the concept of the Mummy as a monster. And maybe it's partly why I'm such a big Halloween fan, because that's kind of a similar deal. Michael Myers is always walking really slow everywhere, very emotionless. But this particular Mummy film really succeeds for me. The one that came out before this one, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, absolutely dreadful. It's not in this ranking, but they really rediscovered their game for this one. One of the main reasons why it works is because it's entirely set in Egypt. Yes, they were probably filming nowhere near Egypt for all I know, but I buy into the illusion. I love the colour of this film and how it looks. Some great kills by the actual creature. Michael Ripper probably gives his best ever Hammer performance as like a little hotel guy running around trying to please everybody. This film just is really enjoyable for me all the way through, and definitely one of the most underrated Hammer films out there. Number 7, we have The Revenge of Frankenstein. So this was the second one that they made. It's a really pure sequel. I mean, it's very, very faithful to the first story, with the possible exception of what they do with the opening. So the first film had such a perfect ending for the character. You didn't really need a sequel, but given that one was going to be made, I guess they've done pretty much the only thing they could have done with the opening to this film. But once we get past that, the story afterwards is very, very logical. I like how so many things are flipped in this film. So Frankenstein's helper this time is somebody who actually is interested in the science, unlike Paul from the first movie, who was a complete skeptic. Frankenstein's character has now moved on to a point where he's even more obsessed with his work, to the point where he doesn't even notice women anymore. He had all these women on the go in the first film. This time around, I mean, he doesn't even notice when Bond girl Eunice Gayson rocks up beside him, not even a flicker on his face. And we also get a creature who actually volunteers for the experiment this time. I think this is the one with the guy with the dodgy arm, so he volunteers in hopes that he'll get this, much better body. So with this film, you get the sort of film that you'll expect coming in, and yet so many things are different that it just feels really fresh and interesting. The ending's a little bit rushed. I mean, it's interesting what they do with the ending, but I think they needed a bit more care and attention to that plot development in order to make it believable. And what makes it even more galling is the fact that The Evil of Frankenstein, which comes after this, just completely ignores it. But that's that film's fault and not The Revenge of Frankenstein. But for me, this is an absolute textbook example of how to do a sequel. It's really good. At number 6, we have The Woman in Black. This is by far the highest ranked of the more recent Hammer films. I've not even seen most of those newer modern Hammers. I mean, if they're gothic in nature, I'll probably check them out. Like that new Dr. Jekyll film, for instance. At some point, I'll probably try that. But some of the other films that have come out more recently, I just look at the plot descriptions and think to myself, I might not ever check that out, ever, probably. But this one, I saw it many, many years ago, instantly loved it. It's about a young lawyer played by Daniel Radcliffe, who is far too young for the part, by the way. I mean, this can't have come out more than 5 minutes after he was done with Harry Potter, and it shows. This character, as played by Radcliffe, he looks barely old enough to be a law student, never mind a lawyer entrusted with going all the way to the northeast to sort out somebody's will and testament. But off he goes, and it's such a creepy journey that he goes on. Even his train journey on the way there is kind of creepy in the way that it's depicted. And once he gets there, he has to spend countless nights in some freaky-looking cottage in the middle of the marshlands near the sea. And it turns out this whole area is being plagued by the mysterious Woman in Black, after which the film is named. There's kids getting killed in this. There's more kids die in this film than adults, and yet it's not in a gruesome way. It's not going to offend anybody's sensibilities or anything like that, but it's a genuinely scary movie. Whether you're into Hammer or not, this should absolutely be on your watch list if you've not seen it. At number 5, we have Brides of Dracula. So this is my favourite Dracula film. There's no more to come after this. The more observant among you will have already noticed, therefore, probably, that my favourite Dracula film doesn't actually have Dracula in it. But then again, the character of Dracula has never been the most important part of a Dracula film for me. This is not intended as a slight on Christopher Lee. I love the man. I love him as Dracula as well. But I just don't think the character is as important to these films as, say, Victor Frankenstein is to the Frankenstein series. But it's also true to say that it's probably kind of a coincidence that Christopher Lee's Dracula isn't in this movie. It's not something that comes to mind when I'm thinking about the fact that Brides of Dracula is my favourite. But this is great all the way through, right from the start when the female character who's lost in the woods ends up at the castle. It's the best looking castle in the entire series. I love the production design in this movie. And then Van Helsing comes into play, and we eventually get a really exciting finale where Van Helsing has to cauterize his own wound, and Dracula's brides, if you like, are hanging around in the background. Cushing does some kind of leap involving a windmill or something. I just love this film from beginning to end. To be honest, I love the first 6 Dracula films that Hammer did, right down to Scars of Dracula, which came 30th in this ranking. Put any of those films on and I'm having a good time. But if you absolutely twisted my arm and asked me to name my absolute favourite, I'd probably say Brides of Dracula. Sorry, Sir Christopher. At number 4, we have Hound of the Baskervilles. Now, before I go any further with this one, let me just announce that I have never in my life seen any other Sherlock Holmes film apart from this one. I've never seen any TV shows involving the character. I've never read any books involving the character. This is literally it for me, this one movie right here. So I've got no favouritism or bias when it comes to Holmes and Watson. I just think this movie happens to be great. I love Andre Morel and Peter Cushing working together. The mystery here is really fascinating. I love the setting. So we're back in Cornwall again, I think, or Dartmoor or somewhere down in that neck of the woods. We've got like quicksand and tarantulas and an escaped prisoner on the loose, and obviously the beast itself. There's so many different threads going on in this movie. It feels like a longer movie than it is somehow. And I've got to say, out of all of Hammer's films, if I had to pick, if I could magic up a sequel to a film that Hammer did, I would choose that for there to be another film after Hound of the Baskervilles involving these same characters. I think my second choice would probably be for there to be a follow-on to the Abominable Snowman, but this would be number 1, Hound of the Baskervilles. It's a shame that this didn't go on to be like a long-running series like Frankenstein ended up becoming, but even with just this being a one-off thing, it's still amazing. It's just a really, really great film, and I imagine that this is probably an opinion shared by many, this one. I can imagine that this is probably one of the most popular Hammer films. At number 3, we have Taste of Fear, by far the best of Hammer's thrillers, if you want to pigeonhole the films into various genres. Their second best thriller for me is probably Paranoiac, which came, 32nd in this list, so quite the difference there. This is a phenomenal film. It's about a young woman in a wheelchair who goes to France, I think, because she's investigating what happened to her missing father. I hope I've got the little minor details correct here. I've not seen the film in a couple of years, and I didn't go and look up the plot before I did the video. I'm just trusting entirely to my own memory here. I think the main character is played by a woman called Susan Strasberg. I think it was her only Hammer film, and she's fantastic in this. The atmosphere in this house that she goes to stay at is incredibly creepy. Like, she's going around this place in a wheelchair late at night, and she's just discovering things all the time. But I mean, it's like The Woman in Black in terms of the general atmosphere of the film. It's really good. There's a brilliant underwater sequence at one point which is freaky as hell, and the big twists when they come are really satisfying. Like, there's one particular twist where it just made me so happy. I just enjoyed this film so much. As soon as it was done, like the following night, I was diving into the special features, watching the commentary tracks and interviews and things like that. I don't do that for every film. That just speaks volumes as to how much I really enjoyed this film. Definitely one of my favourite Hammer films overall. It's probably what you would call a hidden gem. I mean, there's lots of hidden gems, I would say, in this top 50 that a lot of people won't have seen. But for me, this is the most hidden of all the gems. It's the most gemmiest of all the gems. You must see it. So number 2, we have The Mummy from 1959. I was just talking when I was discussing The Mummy's Shroud about how much I love mummy films. I mean, when they are done right, that's a really pleasurable thing for me. When they're done wrong, I feel the pain on the inside. Looking at you, Tom Cruise is the mummy. Looking at you, everyone who had a hand in The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. But this one is brilliant. We've got Lee and Cushing together. I love the first 10 minutes in Egypt and that whole set that they had for that, and the flashbacks later on to Egypt. All the attention to detail with the ornaments and things. Production design in this film is absolutely first rate. We get a villain who is just about a character, I'd say, with the guy who brings Christopher Lee to England. But the actual mummy in the film, played by Lee, fantastic. I mean, I really noticed Christopher Lee's height in this film, more so than in any of his other performances. He's genuinely frightening in this film. Like, the first time I saw this, I was a teenager. I think I was like maybe 13 years old, because this film used to play every now and again on the BBC in the 90s. And I remember watching it in my bedroom late at night. And the scene that always got me the most is the one where he comes through the window and kills the guy in the padded cell, because that guy was just so helpless. He had nowhere to go. And the thing is, at the time, my bedroom was kind of the same size. It had one window, one door, and so it was really effective for me personally. But the film stands up after all these years. I tend to watch it like every 2 or 3 years. I watched it quite recently, actually. It's still so good. That there's just nothing about it I would change. It is, for me, the perfect mummy film. I don't think I've seen a mummy film better than this, made by any studio in any era, honestly. This, for me, probably number 1 when it comes to mummy films. But it's not number 1 when it comes to Hammer films overall. So let's now find out, finally, what that is. Yep, so at number 1 we have The Curse of Frankenstein. I reckon that quite a few people would have guessed what my number 1 was going to be even before I put the picture up, because, I mean, nobody sensible would leave The Curse of Frankenstein out of their top 50. So if you'd noticed that I hadn't come to it yet, then I think a lot of people will have presumed that I was going to put it number 1. But this is the perfect film for me. It's just absolutely wonderful. This was my first Hammer review that I did on the channel about 3.5 years ago, and I was a little bit too strict on it. I only gave it 4 out of 5. I was younger and naive back then, I guess, when it came to reviewing movies. If I was reviewing it again today, it would be a 5 out of 5. I mean, this is solid gold. It's just perfect in every way. Such an engrossing story, watching this guy come to the realization that he wants to put body parts together to create the perfect creature, you know, bring it back from the dead. All the side characters are really well written in this, with Paul and Victor's fiance, even the maid. The castle looks incredible. You get the perfect end to the movie with the creature toppling off the battlements, and then Victor going to jail. His pleas are really emotional towards the end, just before he goes to the gallows. And in a way, the story probably should have ended with this. You don't necessarily need the sequels to this. This works brilliantly as just a one-off story. It's just a brilliantly made horror film. Nothing more need be said. And I didn't really have to think that hard, in all honesty, about whether I was going to put this at number 1. When I was writing them down on paper, it came to me quite quickly that this was going to be my number 1, really. So there we have it. That was my top 50 Hammer films. I'd love to see some lists from you guys in the comments, whether you want to do a top 5, top 10, top 20, whatever you can be bothered to do. I'll happily check it out and I'll give you my opinion on it. But I have come to the end of my Hammer ranking and the end of my Hammer series. I'll be moving on to Amicus now. So thank you for joining me. Take care. I'll see you all again next time. Bye-bye.